In this tutorial guys, I'm going to be sharing how to make a culotte. This is a style inspiration of the tutorial that I'm going to be sharing with you guys. I love the versatility of these garments. These are the measurements that you're going to be needing, so just go ahead and take your measurements. So guys, these are the materials that I use for this tutorial. I've got my measuring tape as always, which is a very important essential. I have my tailor's chalk, fabric scissors, and my all-round pattern master. I've also got some pins. So I went ahead to cut out a reasonable amount of fabric that would be enough for me to draft the front, and I placed it on fold. I cut it out because my fabric was slipping off my table. It was quite a bulky fabric. It was slipping off my table, so I just cut out a sizable amount that would be enough for the front pattern. So guys, to get started with the front pattern, I'm going to be marking 0.75 inches away from the fold. There are so many ways for you to draft a trouser pattern, but this is just one of the ways that I use. So I'm going over to mark 0.75 inches away from the fold, and I'm connecting all the points together. Once I'm through with that, I will then mark half an inch away from the top part of my fabric. This would serve as the seam allowance for the waistline. So guys, from that line I'm going to be marking off 1.5 inch, 1.5 inch, which is my waistband allowance, after which I will be marking all of my other vertical measurements. So I'm taking off 1.5 inches away, and the first measurement I'm taking is my crotch depth, which is 11.5 inches. Afterwards, I will mark the waist to knee measurement, which is 23 inches. Then I'm going to be marking the length of these culottes, which is going to be 37 inches, and an additional 2 inches for M allowance. I'm going to be adding 2 inches for the M allowance. So I'll just go over and then mark all of these lines for better visibility. It is now time for me to start placing my measurement. On the crotch line, I'm going to be marking 1/4 of my hip measurement. So I'm just going over to place that measurement down on that crotch line. Then I'll go up above to the waistline, and I will deduct 1 inch from the measurement I placed on the crotch line. So if I place 10 inches on the crotch line, I will be placing 9 inches on the waistline to get a slanted line this way. Okay, so once that is done, I will then place my crotch extension, which is going to be 2.3 inches. So I'm just going over to mark 2.3 inches, and then I'm creating my crotch curve. After that is done, I'm going to be marking 2 inches below the crotch line. It is on this line that I'm going to be placing my tie round measurement. So you could mark between 2 inches and 2.5 inches below the crotch line. This always works for me. It always works for me. Moving on to the waistline, I'm going to be placing 1/4 of my waist measurement, 6.25 plus 1 inch, that allowance, making a total of 7.25. Thereafter, I'm going to be measuring the entire measurement that I have on the crotch line, including the crotch extension. I would then divide it into 2. So I'm starting my measurement right after the 0.75 inch that I marked initially. I'm not adding that to my measurement, and then I'm going to be marking the midpoint. I'm going to mark that midpoint all the way down on all of my crochet lines. So I'm marking the midpoint on the tie line. I'm also marking the midpoint on the knee line. I will also proceed and mark the midpoint on the full length line. That's not really the ankle line, because this trouser is not getting to my ankle. This midpoint that I marked, I am going to be placing 1/4 of my tie round measurement on both sides of the midpoint. So I'm going over to mark 5.2 inches on one side of the midpoint and 5.2 inches on the other side of the midpoint. So at the end of the day, I should have half of my measurement instead of 1/4 of the measurement. On the knee line, I'm not going to be making use of my knee round measurements because this is free, so I'll just deduct 1 inch from my tie round measurements. Instead of placing 5.25, I'll take away 1 inch and make it 4.25. So I'm marking 4.25 on this part and 4.25 on this part. If you want yours to be a little bit slimmer, you could make use of your tie round measurement. Then going over to the full length line, I'm going to be placing the same measurement, 4.25 on this part and 4.25 on the other part. At the point of sewing, if I see that it is quite big, I'm going to be taking in more fabric to make it a little bit slimmer, but for now I'm going to be leaving it this way. So I'm just going over to connect all of the points together, and you can see how our pattern is taking shape. So far so good, guys. This is what it looks like after connecting them together. So guys, when I'm working with trousers, sometimes I like to add seam allowance only to the side front. That's only to the side and not to the inseam. So for this side, I'm going to be adding 0.75 inches all around. I'm not going to be adding seam allowance to the inseam for the front, rather that seam allowance will go to the back. But for the front, I like to add side seam allowance, and I always like to work with 0.75 because I don't want this to be bulky. Sometimes I even work with half an inch, but to be on the safe side, I like to work with 0.75 inches, and this is what it looks like. So the next thing would be to add my half an inch seam allowance to the waistline, and then I can now proceed to cut this out. In order for me to cut effectively, I'm going to be folding in my seam allowance. I'll just fold it in. It's always very important for you to fold it in and not just cut blindly. So once I've folded it in, I'll grab my scissors and then cut. Afterwards, I'll bring it out and then trim off the excess that I have over there. So once this is all done, I'll proceed and then cut out my fabric. I'll cut out the excess, and then you would see what this looks like. Guys, I'm done, and here is what I have. Now moving on to the back, I'm going to be using the front to cut the back. All I have to do is to place my fabric on fold, which I've gone ahead to do, and I've also placed the front on it. So the very first thing I will do is to mark out the crucial points. I'll go over and extend the waistline onto the fabric that I have folded. I would also extend the crotch line, but for the back, the crotch line will start 0.5 inches lower than the front. I'm extending the thigh line, the knee line, and also the full length line. So once that is all done, the next thing is to place some measurements. On the waistline, I'm going to be marking 2 inches, and this would serve as a seam allowance for both the back crotch and also for both the front crotch. Also moving on, I'm going to be marking an additional 1 inch on the back crotch for ease, and then add 0.75 inch, which is going to be the inseam allowance. For the tie line, I'll just go ahead and mark 0.75 inch. For the knee line, I'm also marking 0.75 inch, and for the full length line, I'm repeating the same thing, 0.75 inch. I'll proceed and connect all of these points together. The waistline for the back is usually elevated because of the bum at the back. So for somebody who is small size like me, I am a size 6, I like to raise my back waistline by 1 inch. But for a bigger size, you could use 1.5 inch. Then I'm going to be drawing it in a slanted manner this way, so the back waistline is always extended, slightly extended, while for the front I would take off some measurements. So I'm just going over to mark 0.75 inches below the front waistline. I'll connect it to the side, and what I'm connecting would be taken off. So the back waistline is extended while the front waistline is deepened. So I'm just going over to cut out the 0.75 inches measurement that I have, and the front waistline is going to be slanting in this manner. Once I'm done, guys, I'll just go over and then cut out my back pattern. So this is all for the back. The back is pretty simple to cut. Once you have your front, all you have to do is to add some extra allowance and then cut out your back. One thing I always like to do when I'm working with trousers is to create notches at every crucial point. So I'm going over to notch the thigh line, the knee line, the full line, and I'm creating the notches on both the front pattern and also on the back pattern. Guys, we're done with the front and the back, and here is what it looks like. The next thing would be to plan the pockets. I mean, what is a trouser without a pocket? So for the pockets, I'm going to be using the front to plan it, obviously. And what I would do is to extend that midpoint line. Remember that midpoint line that we marked on the crotch line? I will extend it to the waistline. So the depth of my pocket is going to end on the crotch line. If you want yours to go lower, it's fine, but I always like my pocket to end on the crotch line rather. So the next thing I will do is to mark my pocket opening, and between 5 to 6 inches is fine. I think I marked about 5.5 inches for the crotch opening. For the pocket opening, why do I keep saying crotch? Afterwards, I will then mark 1 inches from the side, and then I will draw in my pocket opening this way. So you would want to make sure that your hand can fit into the pocket. So this way, all through the crotch line is going to serve as my pocket. So all I have to do is to transfer this to a new fabric and then cut it out. Now to transfer this into a new fabric, I've gone ahead to cut out a fabric of no particular dimension, but it is wide enough to cut out the pocket, and I'm placing the fabric on fold into 2. Afterwards, I will place my front trouser pattern on it. I'll make sure I place it on it very well. Once that is achieved, the next thing would be to trace on the fabric I have underneath. So I'm grabbing my chalk and then I'm going to be tracing along the sides. I'm starting with the sides. I will then mark where my pocket would end, which is on the crotch line. So I'm transferring the crotch line to the fabric I have beneath. I'm also going to be tracing along the waistline too. So we're going to be transferring that to the fabric we have beneath, and I'm going to be marking where the pocket ends on the waistline. This is also important. Next is to mark where the pocket is joined together around this region. So I grab a pin and then I use a pin to transfer that point to the fabric that I have beneath. So once that is done, I will take off my front fabric, my front trouser pattern, and then use my pattern master to connect all of the points together. So guys, I'm going over to add 1/2 inch seam allowances so that my pocket does not become shortened at the point I'm sewing. After cutting, I'm going to be creating a duplicate of this because you would need one for your pocket lining and also one for the pocket bag. So if I put this on my trouser, you would see that it is an exact replica with the exception of the seam allowance that we added. Remember, I said we are going to be cutting a duplicate, so here is the duplicate that I've gone ahead to cut. I'm just going over to mark the sides, and then I'm going to be setting this duplicate aside where I work on one of them. That's the pair. So I have 2 of the pockets pattern that I cut out already. So I'm going to be placing my front pattern on it appropriately. I would make sure that those marks that I marked before, I'll just align it together properly. So once that is done, I'm going to be grabbing my scissors and then cut along the pocket opening. So you're cutting both on your trouser pattern and also on one pair of the pocket pattern that you cut out already. So guys, I'm done cutting and here is what I have. This one that I cut along the pocket opening is what I would use to finish off the raw edges here, while the other one that I kept aside is what that will come in underneath and is what we would use to create a complete pocket bag. So this is how you can cut out your pockets without a pattern. I'm going to be attaching a zipper in the front of the trouser, and for that I need a zipper fly and shield, and I need to know the length of my zipper fly and shield. So I'm just going over to mark the crotch area roughly, and my crotch area is about 10 inches long, so that would help me determine the length of my shield. So I've gone over to cut out the shield, and I didn't show this process because it's very easy. The dimension of this shield is that it is about 9.5 inches long and 2.5 inches on fold. So this is the shield. It is 2.5 inches on fold, while this zipper fly is just a single piece of fabric. It is not on fold. It is also 9.5 inches long and then 2.5 inches wide. It is not on a fold. So guys, this is how you cut a zipper fly and shield. The next thing I'm going to be cutting is the waistband. For the waistband, I've gone ahead to place my fabric on fold, and usually I like to add an extra of about 6 inches allowance to my actual waist measurements. This is because a part of the shield would also sit into the waistband, and if it is excessive, I'll go ahead and cut it out rather than for it not to be enough. Now for the height of the waistband is going to be 1.5 inches. Remember, that was what we took out, plus half an inch seam allowance, and I'm just going over to mark this down. Remember that my fabric is on fold. Once that is done, I'll connect it together and then cut out my waistband. So far so good guys. These are the pattern pieces I'm going to be working on. I have both the front and the back, the waistband, the zipper fly, the shield, and also the pocket. The sewing part of this tutorial is going to come up next. This video is already long and I don't want it to be excessively long, and I want it to be detailed, so that's why the sewing part is going to come up in the next video. If you found this tutorial helpful, please give it a huge thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, kindly click on the subscribe button below, and until my next tutorial, stay blessed.